All the hospitals have been destroyed. All the schools have been destroyed. There literally is nothing left. It's rubble. Israel has gone too far. The United States does have a lot of influence over Israel, but there's a lot more bottom-up activity than you realize. The thing that always gives me hope about America is the thing that Tocqueville noticed when he came to America in 1832. Groups that are not the family, but not the government. That they lie between the family and the government, what we would probably call civil society.
I'm the eternal optimist for however dysfunctional we are now. We're about to celebrate our 250th birthday next year. However, with Donald Trump as president, the world is much less safe. If he is part of the accomplishment of creating a much more peaceful Middle East, you would support him receiving the Nobel Peace Prize. If you're in Vegas right now, would you be betting on Donald Trump getting the Nobel Peace Prize or not?
No, but...
Welcome to another Lunch with Jamie. Fareed Zakaria is here with us, the host of GPS on CNN, writer for Washington Post, as well as acclaimed author and political commentator. Fareed, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
So, as many of you know from watching Fareed on GPS, that's one of my favorite shows of the week. But Fareed is also an author. He's written 5 books. His most recent book is The Age of Revolutions, which I know you've all read and purchased. If you haven't by now, please click the link in the chat and buy it while we're on this conversation. GPS truly has become my can't miss show. A Sunday doesn't go by without me watching it. And I have to be honest, I truly look forward to Fareed and with his catchphrase, and here's my take. It sets me up for every week. It's the most important thing I know I'm going to hear. And that comes along with reading his Washington Post column and the show itself. I really been wanting to have Fareed on for a long time. This is a couple of years in the making. Fareed may or may not know that, but it's really an honor. As members of Jamie's List, everybody here today, you guys get to vote on our topics for the conversation. So make sure you do that. We're going to put a poll in the chat right now. So make sure to vote for what Fareed and I are going to cover. And Fareed, we are going to start with the toughest conversation of the day, since it's called Lunch with Jamie. We have to ask a food question.
All right.
I know you live in New York City and you were born in India. And since India is one of my favorite cuisines, I would love you to finish this sentence. You haven't eaten Indian food until you've eaten at these restaurants. The only caveat is one of them cannot be a family member's house.
No, that's easy. At Saravana Bhavan, it's spelled Sara, Saravanna, Bhavan, which you don't need to know that part. And the reason is it's South Indian breakfast food, which is dosas and idlis and things like that. And it's a completely different kind of food. Most people, when they eat Indian food, India is really a continent, not a country. And when they eat Indian food, they're eating basically North Indian court cuisine. This was the food of the Mughals, but it has very little relationship to a lot of the other cuisines all over India. And one of my favorites is this kind of South Indian breakfast food. It's basically it's kind of rice flour and lentil crepes of various kinds, and then steamed rice cakes. And then you put the usual Indian sauces and curries on it. But it's really amazing. My kids, who are completely American, would tell you still that this is their single favorite food in the world.
Wow. Okay, great. Well, now I can't wait to go there. My go-to would be Gymkhana in London as well.
Oh, you're fancy, Jamie. You're like, you want the Michelin 2 stars. All right, all right. It is very, very good. It is very good, Gymkhana.
But that is so exciting. I can't wait to try it. And I also, although a wine won't go with that, I've heard a rumor that you're also a wine connoisseur. So my question was going to be, what wine goes with that meal? Does wine go with a dosa or no?
Wine doesn't really go with Indian food. People try to claim that it does, but it really doesn't. I feel as though if you're having Indian food, you might as well just have a beer. It's going to taste better,
I love Indian beer. I love a good Taj. So, great. All right. Well, thank you for that. And thank you for going along with that. Now we're going to get into some of the more serious topics of the day. The first place I want to start is the Middle East and Israel. we had Dan Senor recently on a conversation, and Dan said something I thought was very interesting, which was in the conversation, which has now become uh, something that happened every day about has Israel gone too far? And Dan's point was Israel going too far is a sentiment and it's not a strategy. And his point was I haven't heard another strategy that's going to work to get rid of Hamas at this point. You know, and for me personally, when you see what's happening in the destruction and devastation in Gaza, it's too much for me to handle. But I don't have another strategy. So I guess my question is, you know, do you think there's something fair to the statement Israel has gone too far at this point? And if not, what is their current strategy as you see it?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and Dan is a very smart guy and a good friend. But I would disagree with him. I think that Israel has gone too far, and has gone too far in two senses. One, the scale of the destruction in Gaza is just extraordinary. Probably about 5% of the population has been killed. Probably, I mean, these are UN estimates. 90% of all buildings in Gaza have been destroyed. Think about that. 90% of all the buildings in a place that houses 2 million people. All the hospitals have been destroyed. All the schools have been destroyed. And you've seen the pictures. When you say destroyed, I mean, there literally is nothing left. It's rubble. So there's no question that in any human level, and I think it's sometimes important not to forget the human dimension when thinking about these human beings. The scale of the devastation is just breathtaking and stunning. So then the question becomes, what is the strategy? What could the strategy be? Are there alternatives? And I think the answer to all that is yes, yes, and yes. And what I would point to is, former prime ministers of Israel, from Ehud Omer to Ehud Barak, have been saying there is another way. Former heads of the IDF have been saying it. The retiring head of Shin Bet just left saying what we are doing in Gaza is just kind of just crazy killing and it has no purpose and we have to stop. So I think there's no question that there are lots of people in Israel who would argue that there's another path. Now, what's the basic problem? The basic problem is we don't know what to do after, right? The Israelis are the reason they're doing this almost kind of mindless, just destroy, 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 because the idea is you'll somehow pummel Hamas into non-existence, and then you can take over. But you still will need some entity to govern Gaza after that. There are three possibilities: Israelis, Palestinians, Arabs. I can tell you from talking to lots of Arabs, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE, people very high up, none of them are going to do it for an obvious reason. You put these people in and somebody fires at them. Are they going to start shooting on Palestinians? Are they going to put themselves? Secondly, if there's a security disturbance and an Israeli army unit comes in because Israel is going to retain ultimate security. Do the Saudis want to be face to face with the IDF? Do the UAE want to be face to face? So they're not going to do it. Then you get to Palestinians. And here's the basic problem. Bibi Netanyahu does not want the Palestinian Authority in charge of Gaza in any shape or form. So if you say you can't have Hamas, which I totally understand and support, you can't have the Palestinian Authority. What Palestinian is going to be willing to go in there? And that has been the search, by the way. So if you want to go behind the scenes, what the Qataris have been trying to find are some Palestinians who are credible, non-Hamas, non-PA people. But if you find that a problem, then you get to Israel. Does Israel want to reoccupy Gaza? So those are your three choices. And the middle one, the reason it is not viable is that Bibi does not want the PA involved. Why? Because if the Palestinian Authority is involved in Gaza, what it suggests is there could be a unified Palestinian entity that represents the Palestinians in both the West Bank and Gaza, which is a step towards a Palestinian state. And the people in his coalition, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, have made it clear that they would resign if that happens. The government falls. Bibi faces prosecution. This is why both Ehud Olmert and Ehud Barak say the war has been going on to perpetuate one person's term in office not for Israel's national security. So that's my own sense that there is an alternate path. It's a tough one. You have to trust the PA, which is dysfunctional in many ways. But what's the alternative? Does Israel want to go back in and govern Gaza? Do they want to hope for some fairy tale of Arab force that's never going to appear? So that's what you're left with.
For people who missed the show on Sunday, you
Mhm.
had Omer Bartov on the show, who has been a loud, outspoken critic of what's going on and has said multiple times what Israel is doing is committing a genocide. I agree with a lot of what you just said, and I think I'm at the place where I feel like Israel's gone too far, but at the same time, as I said, I do not have a strategy of what the other options are. But I don't think it's fair to say Israel's committing a genocide. I think based on what we've seen previously in other genocides, it's very different. I'd like you to reiterate kind of what you said on the show and what your anything else that may come to mind on that topic.
Sure. My own view is yours. I think what Israel is doing is horrific. I think it's gotten beyond a point of having any. It's not wedded to any strategy. There's almost and no question there's indiscriminate killing of civilians that is taking place. But I don't think it's genocide. And I think the word genocide is used too loosely in general. I think that's really the issue. What Omar Bartov, who's probably the world's leading scholar of genocide, was sort of expressing is that if you use the UN Convention on Genocide terminology, Israel does meet those criteria, which I think is basically accurate. But I think those criteria, frankly, just they can cover a lot of things. When it says you're destroying a nation in whole or in part, making efforts to all those kinds of things. I mean, I think at some level you want to use the word genocide, and you want to reserve the word genocide for the intentional, somewhat successful and large scale, destruction of a people. So I, for example, am also very uncomfortable when people talk about the Chinese committing genocide against the Uyghurs. Most people would be surprised to hear this, but do you know how many people have died as a result of state violence in Xinjiang in China? Probably about 1,000 in total over the last 10 years. That's not genocide. I mean, what they're doing is very bad. It's a kind of weird totalitarian forced re-education that takes place in mass labor camps. I don't like it at all. I think it's gross. But it's not genocide. And I think the same way I would use that. I would say that Israel is doing something deeply immoral in Gaza. It does not is no longer tied to a political strategy. There may be individual cases in which there are war crimes that have taken place, some unit here, there. But I wouldn't use that word. And as you could see, I pushed back in the interview, but I also thought it was important for people to hear what a lot of scholars think and what a lot of the discourse in large parts of the world has become, because this is one of the things that I think, as somebody who's a supporter of Israel, that I worry that Israel is losing enormous amount of political support around the world, and that people are a little bit blind to that.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I think, although as I said, I think Israel's gone too far at the same time, we have to get rid of Hamas once and for all, if in theory that's possible. And I do believe that at the core, that's the goal of Israel, even with all the complications around Netanyahu and his cabinet. But I think that this issue has now become this lightning rod in our society and politics. This concept of the U.S. support of Israel, support of weapons. I hear it every day. A politician comes out and says, I think we need to be careful about just unilaterally giving arms to Israel. Okay, I understand that. But all of a sudden, they just get immediately attacked. There's so little room for nuance anymore, right? Because it's just headlines and clickbait and whatnot. What do you think the right approach for a U.S. politician today is in Washington and with their supporters? Do you have a sort of message to them?
I think that more than anything else, what people should remember is that the United States does have a lot of influence over Israel. It could do some of the things people are describing, but Israel is going to do what it feels is in its national interest. And you're probably better off having a good, constructive relationship with Israel if you want it to, to do go along the lines you want. Israel has made concessions in the past when it has felt that it has a close relationship with Washington. It doesn't tend to listen. People don't realize Israel is, a small country surrounded by a lot of countries that have historically tried to eliminate it. So it has a very heightened sense of its own security, and it tends to act even when the United States doesn't want it to. Let me give you a simple case in point right now in Syria. What Israel is doing is something the Trump administration absolutely explicitly does not want it to do. It is bombing the new government of Damascus. The Trump administration has made clear they think this is a terrible idea. You're going to destabilize the country. But the Israelis have a very heightened concern about any use of the Israeli or the Syrian army close to their border. So this is the big debate. The Americans want a strong central Syrian government. The Israelis say, yeah, no, but not so strong that it can pose any kind of threat to us. Um, that's a case where you'd think Donald Trump has influence with the Syrians, right? With the Israelis. But as it turns out, so I would say that politicians should remember that Israel is not a puppet of Washington. It's not like the president calls and says, we're going to do this. I've spent enough time, talking to people very high up in the U.S. government about what Israel, for example, what kind of notice Israel gave the United States before it bombed Iran. And the basic notice was, we're going to do something. It's going to be pretty significant. That's all we can tell you. Watch. And then 6 hours later, this is when the Iranian air defenses were bombed. I just say one thing, by the way, Jamie, because you brought it up, and it's a very good point about Hamas. I do think that the idea should be to get rid of Hamas. But what does Hamas mean? If by Hamas you mean the organization, it's kind of heads, chief planners, the people who involved in what we call the military committee and things like that, they're all dead. There's nobody left there. If you mean there are armed fighters who say they're Hamas, so what you're then asking is can you bomb into non-existence the idea of armed resistance to Israeli occupation? And that seems to me a very hard thing when you have an occupation that's been as long going and frankly as tough as the Israeli occupation is. There are going to be people who want to take up arms, right? So you can't make the goal that every last fighter who you see who says, and because by the way, every time you kill and bomb, you're probably radicalizing 5 of them. And so that you'd get yourself into a kind of never-ending trap. David Petraeus said something really smart on my show right at the start of the war. He said what the Israelis are very good at doing is, killing the bad guys, clearing the land. But then what they have to do, and our experience in Iraq and Afghanistan showed, you got to build a political structure, some kind of political organization that can run that place. So that's why he used to always call it clear, hold and build. And the Israelis are doing no building, so they're going to have to keep going back to the same places. And this was at a time when people like Netanyahu were like, we've done it. We've cleared out Khan Yunis. We've cleared out Rafah. We've cleared out. And they've gone back to these places 4 or 5 times now because of that problem, which is if you don't build something, somebody is going to sit there with a machine gun and say, I'm opposed to Israeli occupation. And if that's your definition of Hamas, Israel is going to be in this for another 20 years.
Yeah, that's really well said. And as you point out in the book, if you look at what America has done in Iraq and Afghanistan, we've proven that does not work, that strategy. You mentioned Syria, Iran. When you were at the Aspen Ideas Festival, you had Thomas Friedman on, and he said something that I thought was such a brilliant quote, which was 3 things can be true at the same time. What Israel has done in 75 years, it's amazing. It's an amazing place. 2, they can do really bad things, like what they're doing on the West Bank and in Gaza. And 3, Israel lives in a crazy neighborhood. Can you talk a little bit about Syria? It's something that I feel very uneducated about, to be honest, and it's hard to keep up with all the different conflicts and all the different, you're someone who studies it all the time, probably the same way in many ways. But can you talk a little bit about Syria?
Sure. One thing it shows you is the fragility and the dynamism of, stuff that happens in the world. So, if you remember, there was a civil war in Syria. People tried to rise up against Assad, the long-standing dictator of Syria. His father had been the dictator of Syria. So you're talking about a 30 odd year, 40 odd year family dynasty. And it seemed that by, I'd say, 2012, 2013, Assad had sort of won the civil war. He had put down the resistance, which was largely Islamist, meaning it was like Al Qaeda and groups like that. And Assad had seemed to win, and he had won because of a lot of help from Iran and from Russia. And we, myself included, sort of stopped paying a lot of attention to it because we assumed Assad had won, and we kind of were like the debate. I know within the American government by 2020 was, should we be recognizing Assad? Should we just accept the reality that the Assad government is bad? And then what happens is two big shifts take place. One, the Russians get bogged down in Ukraine, and so Russian support to the Assad government sort of essentially ends. Second, the Iranians face an Israel that has become much more aggressive, taking the war to Iran and its proxies and bombing Syria. Syria is basically the supply route between Iran and Hezbollah. So that was how Iran would get stuff to Hezbollah. It was through Syria. And the Israelis start bombing all that. And those two things put together, the collapse of Iranian support, collapse of Russian support, maybe a third thing, increased Israeli bombing. It suddenly the Assad regime starts collapsing. And it first happens in Aleppo, and then boom, within like 2 weeks, the regime has collapsed, Assad has fled, and the guy who's taken over is one of these Islamist groups, a kind of Al Qaeda style Islamic radical. But he's now talking a new game, and he's talking about how he wants peace in the Middle East, and he wants, a kind of open government. He even made noises about wanting to have better relations with Israel. So that's the new Syrian government. But as I said, the big controversy now is the Trump administration wants to support them. They've waived all sanctions. The Israelis are still very wary because Israel has now decided that Israel has now positioned itself as the superpower of the Middle East, and they don't want any kind of threat. And they feel that the Syrian army getting close to the Israeli border, whatever they're doing, is too dangerous. And then there's another final complication, which is the Syrian army has been attacking the Druze community. Um, Now there are fellow Druze in Israel. The Druze community in Syria is Christian. The Druze community in Israel is sort of associated with it. And that Druze community in Israel is a core voting group for Netanyahu's coalition. So again, there is a domestic politics angle to this.
Wow. Yeah, it's that's really helpful. Thank you very much for that. I you said something that I've now started to say in my own chat groups, which relates to Donald Trump. I've personally have felt that with Donald Trump as president, the world is much less safe. I think that his erratic behavior, his irrational behavior makes the world much less safe. However, you said recently that if he is part of the accomplishment of settling, of creating a much more peaceful Middle East and sort of and ending some of these conflicts or helping, that you would support him receiving the Nobel Peace Prize. I actually agree with that, and I've been saying that, and I'm getting a lot of heat in my chat groups. So my question is kind of twofold. One, do you think I'm right and wrong in that statement with the world being a kind of less safe place? And what I mean by that is, you have bad actors that are some of our most dangerous things today, and I think Donald Trump is flaming the fire of those types of people. And yes, you may be helpful in eliminating a conflict overall from a international standpoint, but when it comes to individuals, he's just he's making things worse. But so one, do you agree with that? And then two, if you're in Vegas right now, would you be betting on Donald Trump getting the Nobel Peace Prize or not?
All right. So on the first question, the way I think, to think about it is the United States has played an incredible stabilizing role in the world by having a network of alliances all over the world of countries that are committed to, an open, rules-based international order, some degree of decency in international life, some degree of, human rights observance in international life. And that is true, obviously, in Europe with our European allies. That's been true in Asia with our Asian allies like Japan and South Korea, Australia, Singapore, New Zealand. And the United States has always tried to, in some way or the other, um, kind of set the agenda for the world on some of these kinds of issues. And what's happening is by Trump adopting a completely mercenary transactional approach to international relations, where he's firstly, hitting our allies hardest with things like tariffs, squeezing them, showing a complete indifference to NATO and NATO alliances, being willing to kind of embrace a kind of very narrow short-term transactionalism. It's encouraging others to do the same. Everyone is searching around and thinking to themselves, where do we stand in this kind of world? What do we do? Let me give you a simple example. Brazil. We don't think a lot about Brazil, right? It's the largest country in Latin America. Brazil, the United States runs a trade surplus with Brazil. So there is no trade deficit. There's no problem. Um, Under the Trump tariff regime, they should get the lowest level of tariffs, which, alas, even then is still 10%. But that's what Britain got because we have a trade surplus with Britain. Trump has proposed 50% tariffs against Brazil. Why? Because the Brazilian court system has indicted and appears to be ready to convict the former president Bolsonaro, who is a right-wing populist like Trump, who, like Trump, tried to overturn the results of his election, which he lost. But in Brazil, those things are clearly, violations of the law. He's been taken to court. Courts have found him guilty. And so Trump says, if you don't drop all cases against him, you're going to have this tariff on. In other words, there's nothing to do with trade. It has nothing to do with anything other than helping his pal Bolsonaro. The Brazilians can't do that. They have a real court system. The president doesn't have the power to arbitrarily yank some case out of court. So they're going to be stuck with a 50% tariff. What's going to happen? The Brazilians sell soybeans, stuff like that, commodities. They're going to sell them all to China. You're going to take the largest country in Latin America and turn it into a solid ally of the Chinese. You're going to do something very similar to Vietnam, which has been trying to get out of China's shadow and work more with the United States. So that, those are the kind of things that are creating a more transactional, freelancing world in which you have less rules-based behavior, you have less open economics, you have a much greater reliance on Chinese supply chains than American supply chains. How is that good for us? So that's just to support your first point. On the betting, no, look, I really do. What I was trying to say is I'm not so committed to, feeling that Trump is a bad guy or a bad president that I'm going to disregard things when he does the right thing. And I've tried to do that. I've tried to when I saw him doing something good, I've tried to encourage it. And he does have an opportunity, and he does have the political capital because he is regarded by the Israelis as solidly behind them. He is trusted by Bibi Netanyahu. He has the capacity to tell them, look, you have this problem. You've got 5 million Palestinians living on territory you control. You got to do something about it. Here's a path. Here's a solution. And by the way, if you do this, I can get the Saudis to normalize relations with you. So there's like a really interesting package deal, which would enormously boost Israel's security. Saudi Arabia would be the most important normalization for Israel in its history. And, and you can go down. And if he were to do that, I would totally support it. I would support, him getting the Nobel Prize. Do I think he's going to do it? And that gets to Vegas. No, because Trump doesn't. He has rarely done something where you have to do something politically hard and take the political consequences and spend the political capital. It's very hard to find cases where he's done things like that. So I color me skeptical, but if he does it, I would be the first to cheer.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I mean, Trump does so many things that are so awful, and in no way do I think he has been a positive on any form of society, full stop. Um, but I'm not going to sit here and root against him and the country because of it. And I'm not going to root against him trying to create some sort of peace. And if people want to be mad at me for that, that's fine. I have people that I know that are in his administration, and I call them out and say, listen, if you're going to be there, it's your responsibility to call him out when he says things that are inflammatory, which happens daily. But there's no reason to root against anything that's going to be positive for our country or for any country around the world. So
Totally, totally.
he wins the Nobel Peace Prize. I will not be at the ceremony. Not sure if you're inviting me, and I'm not sure I'll buy that copy of Time Magazine or whatever puts him on the cover, but it will be a positive. I just had someone check. Right now it looks like there's a 6% chance that Donald Trump will win the Nobel Peace Prize based on Polymarket. So we'll have to come back and check on that. I want to switch topics a bit. I mean, you've had so many different things that we could fill an hour or two or more. But you in 1997 wrote a piece for Foreign Affairs discussing the risks of illiberal democracy, and that's been a term you've used multiple times. You use it in the new book. Would you first kind of define that for people who don't know what that is?
Yeah. So what I was noticing in the 1990s was something that I thought was really troubling, which was you're seeing a lot of countries around the world embrace democracy, and you think this would be a really good thing. And then I'd go to these places, and I noticed it didn't look like a democracy. And then I was trying to ask myself, what's going on here? Why is it? I mean, they did hold elections, and the elections were basically free and fair. And I came to realize that, when we think of democracy in the Western world, we're sort of talking about two different traditions. We're talking about voting and elections. That's about political participation and power. And we're also talking about the rule of law, the separation of branches, separation of church and state, maybe, the protections for minorities, for individual rights. So, in one sense, we're talking about the voting stuff, which is the empowering. How do you empower government? And the other is how do you restrain government so that you protect the rights of the individual? So it's in a sense, one is the democracy part and one is the liberal part, which together makes up a liberal democracy. And what I was noticing was that in a lot of countries, you were getting the democracy, but not the liberalism. So you were getting illiberal democracy. Countries in which free and fair elections, a party would come into power and would systematically oppress minorities, destroy the independent judiciary, attack the free media. And this was happening in Pakistan, it was happening in the Philippines, it was happening in some of the countries in Eastern Europe in those days, Slovakia. Um, and I actually talked about the Palestinian Authority as a place where exactly that was happening, which turned out to be completely true. That they stopped even having elections after a while. Mahmoud Abbas is on the, I think, 14th year of his fourth 4-year term. But it's become a much bigger deal than I thought, because I was seeing it in these, third world developing countries that were adopting this stuff. And think about the definition I just gave you and ask yourself, does it not apply to the United States today? A government where you've had an election, a free and fair election, a person who's come into power. And is it not fair to say that there are various ways in which he is attacking independent media, suing large media organizations to intimidate them, attacking courts, defying court orders, attacking the Supreme Court justice, attacking separations of powers, even and including the Federal Reserve. So what I had thought was going to be like a distant problem of the Perus and the Pakistans and the Palestinian authorities of the world has come home to roost.
Yeah, it is scary to look at that, and I think you're right. I mean, you talk about in the book, you talk about this steady unraveling of American legitimacy, and you start back in with Iraq, and then you go to the 2008 crash, and then you get to Trump. Do you think that we're headed down this path, and this is what you kind of see now for the foreseeable future? Do you think there's a way for us to really effectively change that path? And what do you think America needs to do to kind of regain some of its standing in the world?
I don't know. That is a very tough question. I'll tell you what I think is the problem, which is um, we've really gotten to a point where we as a country and as a society, we have lost all trust in institutions and elites. So, you think about, as you said, with Iraq, with the global financial crisis, with COVID, you saw an even greater degree of suspicion. And you can't run a country without some kind of institutions and I mean, somebody is on top, right? Like somebody is actually running the place in charge of institutions, in charge of big organizations, and that is a kind of elite. But we have developed such a kind of radical anti-elitism that nobody trusts the elite. Nobody trusts, think about what's going on with this Jeffrey Epstein thing, right? It's a fascinating situation because the Trump administration has benefited and fueled this idea of conspiracies, and the elites are and the deep state are keeping things from you and hiding secrets and covering up their crimes. And then it comes to power. So the movement that has been against the deep state is in charge of the deep state. And they most people don't seem to realize this. They opened up the JFK files. There was nothing. They opened up the RFK files. There was nothing. They opened up the Martin Luther King files. There was nothing. They opened, and I guarantee you, at some point in some process, much of the Epstein stuff will be opened up. And my own gut is that there isn't that much, you're going to be able to find. But the energy and that this is what fuels the movement, this feeling that the elites are crooked, they're hiding things out. And if that is your mantra, you're going to have this very fractional, polarized, take no prisoners kind of politics. uh you can see it like even on things like healthcare, and nobody trusts the CDC or the NIH anymore. They want to trust some television doctor. It's become trust has shifted, been transferred completely from institutions to individuals. And it's very hard to build something just with an individual, right? That's a personality cult. And it used to be, we used to think of societies as modernizing by replacing personality cults with institutions, by replacing the rule of kings with the rule of parliaments and courts and political parties. So to me, it feels like a very big break in the American political fabric, a big tear. And I don't have a good answer as to how we kind of knit it back together.
I'm the eternal optimist. I look at the fact that for however dysfunctional we are now, uh, we're about to celebrate our 250th birthday next year. You and your book start out by talking about Cicero and when his younger brother gave advice to him in 64 BC. And his advice was promise everything to everyone, always be seen in public, surrounded by your most passionate supporters, and remind voters of your opponent's sex scandals. I mean, this political world is cyclical. It is, you go through ebbs and flows and ups and downs, and we're just in a down period. And Donald Trump has taken us really low. You also highlighted in the book what the four ideas that Trump's rallies, what he basically said in those rallies. Would you mind telling people how you sum up Trump's rallies?
Yeah, I'd watch these rallies on TV for hours and hours. And what I was struck by the way, it's important to point out, like all the other Republican candidates, this was in 2016, what was sort of repeating the Reagan formula: free markets, free trade, cut the budget deficits, spread democracy abroad. And that was really the kind of Ronald Reagan mantra. Trump was saying something completely different. And it was long and meandering, but if you were to sum it up, he was basically saying, the Chinese are taking your factories. The Mexicans are taking your jobs. The Muslims are trying to kill you. I will beat them all up. And you'll be great again. That was the and in a way, there's a political genius to that. He saw that the working class new voter of the Republican Party was culturally nationalist, protectionist, conservative, suspicious of the outside world, and couldn't give a damn about entitlement reform, balanced budgets, free markets, free trade. So he saw that shift. I've always thought Trump is not a great businessman, but he's a great salesman. And a great salesman always understands what the audience wants to hear. And he understood what that Republican base audience wanted to hear, and he gave it to them.
P.T. Barnum is so jealous of how good Trump is. He really is the greatest charlatan, greatest showman that there's ever been. And related to that, the thing that shocks me, again, something you talk about in your book, is how, in the history of time, the everything Trump is for has not worked, and these free markets and liberalism and strong immigration, that's what the thing that works time and time again. And the amazing thing is that Trump is so good at marketing and spinning and confusing people and convincing people of the truth. I mean, you talk about, just look at immigration as a great example. You talked about it in the show this weekend. Trump is doing a poor job across the board on immigration. I mean, there's nothing he's doing well. If you wanted him to be the person deporting everybody, he's not doing that, because Obama was deporting more people than he was. I mean, there's literally nothing he does well when it comes to any of these topics. Could you talk a little bit about the immigration stats? Because I think that's just so indicative of everything else that's going on today.
Yeah, he's deporting almost half as many people as Obama did in the peak year. And the reason is, in his case, he's choosing optics over outcomes. What they're going for is this very dramatic, draconian, kind of ostentatiously cruel approach. Because, the way you make government work, even for deportations, is you work with local officials, you work with the courts, you follow the laws, you kind of you understand how the process works. You don't just go in there and, blast your way into places, round up kids, send them to El Salvador. Courts are going to keep blocking that. There's going to be administrative procedures that you haven't followed. So part of it is that I think the chaos he thought would demonstrate that he was being, he was taking this serious. The cruelty would demonstrate that he was doing this seriously. Fascinatingly, and very hopeful sign, Americans are turning against this. So the most interesting stuff I've seen on immigration is the polling data. So now you have a situation where a majority of the public disapproves of what Trump is doing on immigration, more disapproved than approved, which is a complete reversal from when he took office. And more generally, attitudes towards immigration have been moving up. So you have 75% people saying immigration is a good thing in this country. That's up from 65% last year and 60% 2 or 3 years ago. When you ask what do you think we should do with the illegals in this country? 80% of Americans now say they should be given legal status of some kind. That's another big shift up. So I think what that says to you, the American people are sort of in the middle on immigration. When they watch Biden's chaotic and crazy open border policy, which it was, they rebelled and they moved to the right. But when they're watching Trump's cruelty, they're moving to the left. And with what they want, I think, is tough enforcement, real borders. We're a nation of laws, but we're also a nation of immigrants. And we want, through a legal process, through a humane process, we should be taking immigrants in. So if you can get that balance right, and I hope the Democrats are able to, because the last time around they went way too far left. Abolish ICE, don't enforce the laws. If they get this balance right, that is the sweet spot. Which is actually, to your point about being an optimist, it's a very optimistic thing to see that the American people are actually in a very sensible place on immigration.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds crazy. Common sense politics should be where we're at. I mean, it seems like that's what people want, at least what they say and what they vote in polls. We're not seeing that, right? Because the extremes on both sides, the left and the right, are still dominating the conversation. They dominate social media. No Democrats believe in defunding the police. No Democrats, as you said, believe in open borders. I mean, it's just not the case. Are you seeing you know what you said in regards to immigration is so on point. Are you seeing anybody socializing those ideas in the political sphere, Democrats or Republicans, who are talking about these sort of common sense immigration reform?
Not yet. First of all, on the Republican side, I've never seen anything like this. The degree of kind of just bending the knee to whatever Trump says, they basically don't exist as a party anymore. They've become a personality cult. I mean, think about this. In the last Republican National Convention, you did not have even invited to that convention any former president who was a Republican, any vice president, any presidential nominee, any vice president, including, by the way, Trump's own vice president, Mike Pence. But you had five members with five speakers in primetime speaking slots whose last name was Trump. This has become a family cult, and people just toe the line. So there, you're not going to see anything there. Where you should see it is on the Democratic side. You haven't yet. I think the Democrats, I hope they realize that, when they kind of move too far left to please the mythical primary Democratic voter, or the Bernie bro, or the AOC supporter, they're losing mainstream America. They're losing the middle of the country on a lot of these social issues like immigration, like this, trans stuff. I think Rahm Emanuel said it very well. If you go so far left that you leave the room on those issues, they stop listening to you about economics. They actually agree with you on economics, but if they think you're some kind of crazy far left, radical hippie, they're just not going to listen to you on economics.
Yeah, I think that's well said. And I really hope that people, especially on the Democratic side, stop trying to appease the fringe ideas and voters. I'm a big supporter of making this tent as big as possible, and I think there's an opportunity for it. And I think people have to stop being closed off from people who say things they disagree with. I think AOC is the best example of that. She says a lot of things that make me angry, but at the same time, where she is today versus where she was when she started is a radically different person. And you'd almost call her a moderate compared to where she was or some of the
Yeah,
people
yeah.
influenced by. And people who think she's just kind of going away are out of their minds. She's one of the most dynamic political figures there is. And if you're under 30, you're obsessed with her. So if you want to just put your earmuffs on or just, say why you don't like her, you got to figure out ways to bring her in, as well as a lot of other candidates. Now I do want to highlight the fact that you mentioned the members of the Trump family who spoke. You forgot, Hulk Hogan spoke at the RNC. You had Kid Rock. You had Amber Rose. You had, maybe you didn't have former presidents, but you had those people.
But that tells you something interesting, by the way. The Hulk Hogan thing, again, back to Trump being politically very savvy. What was that about? Like, we watched it and we thought, oh, this guy is so, it's so crass, it's vulgar. What is he doing? What he was doing was, and I think Trump does this subconsciously. In other words, I think it's all intuition with him. What he was doing was he was saying to the non-college educated voter, maybe Hispanic, maybe African American, what conception of which party are you more comfortable with? The party of, gender neutral norms and unisex bathrooms, or the party of Hulk Hogan? And for a lot of men and a lot of young men, the idea of, being much more proud of your masculinity and, accepting of it and celebrating it the way Hulk Hogan did, tearing his shirt off, was more comfortable than this talk about trans athletes and things like that. And so he does these things which are he's very good at symbolic politics. And he can often do it in cruel ways. So I saw him there, a few months ago. Somebody asked him, somehow Pete Buttigieg came up, and he said, "Oh, the guy doesn't have a clue. He's never good." It's sweet to watch him and his husband go to work together. But it's and what he was doing there was just reminding people, by the way, just remember he's gay. It's like Trump is very clever at playing at the dog whistle, the cultural politics. How do you just remind people they're different? He's very good at othering. And with the Hulk Hogan thing, he found a way to make people feel comfortable Why? By just using some symbolism.
You've talked a lot in on the show and in your book about sort of where the U.S. is positioned today. You talk about how Trump has some big fans in Israel. I think you said Kenya and the Philippines, if I'm not mistaken. So
And India and Hungary, so it's not there are places for sure.
this new world order we're sort of living in is complicated. I mean, it's not just America and America first. Where do you think the sort of the new this sort of shakes out now? And as you kind of look forward, does is America still sort of the leading the charge in a real way for the foreseeable future, or are we now at a place now where these other countries are kind of neck and neck and how critical they are to the kind of daily life?
It's a really good question because, I've been thinking about this. One of the great superpowers of America has always been that it sort of set the agenda for the world. Ever since 1945, it's been the United States that has said, here, let's try to create a better world, and here's what we're going to do. And I think Americans don't take enough pride in this, frankly. After 1945, it's the U.S. who sets up the international system, rules-based, open trade. Let's try to institutionalize some things like foreign aid, which barely existed before that. Human rights. Let's try and open our markets up to everybody so people can grow their way out of the poverty of World War II or the poverty that they've had for centuries in Asia. All this was done under an American umbrella with America advocating for it. And that has been one of the, America has sort of set the master narrative that allowed countries to move in the direction they wanted. And of course, there were countries who didn't want to. There was a whole communist world that didn't want to go down that path. What's fascinating now is the US has sort of gone in a different direction and said, we don't like this globalized world. We don't like the open world. We don't like the rules-based system. We wanted nationalism, protectionism, every country for itself. And what's interesting is you go around the world, other countries are not following. The US is off on its own path, but most other countries are not becoming more protectionist because they understand that if you want to raise standards of living in India, in Africa, in Europe, you need more trade, not less trade. So what's happening is they're all managing around America. They're like, America's too important to ignore. So they're trying to figure out what do you have to do to bend the knee to Trump, to make whatever concessions, make whatever accommodations you need to. But then they're going behind America's back, as it were, and making free trade deals with one another. India signed one with the UK, the European Union is signing one with Latin America, the Asians are signing more and more of these free trade deals with each other. So everyone is kind of freelancing. And so you have a kind of rudderless world because if the US is not setting the agenda, it's not really like the Chinese are setting it. The Russians are not setting it. Nobody wants, there's no Russian dream that everyone is aspiring to. So what you're ending up with is the country that has tended to set the standards, the kind of spokesman is off on its own path. There are some small followers, Orban in Italy, in Hungary, sorry, and the Polish populist nationalists and Nigel Farage in Britain. But for the most part, countries are just like trying to figure out how do we appease America, make that problem, minimize that problem, and then go about and do our own thing. And as a result, it's partly a more unruly world, partly a world in which, countries are figuring out how to freelance. But it's very sad because, this was one of the greatest legacies that the United States bestowed on the world. This was something that, until 1945, if you look at the history of international relations, it was just wars, nationalism, protectionism. And then the US comes in and says, no, we have a better idea. And let's try and do it this way. And it has been the most remarkable success. It's the longest period of great power, peace in human history. Largest number of people lifted out of poverty in human history. And the US has done fantastically. We are on top of this world. We are, most people would be surprised to hear this, but US, despite the rise of China, the rise of India, the rise of all of Asia, the US's share of global GDP today is slightly higher than it was the year that Ronald Reagan was elected president 50 years ago. We were 25% then, we're at 27% right now. So we've done amazingly. The dollar is the reserve currency of the world. We can borrow, in a way that we can run deficits like nobody else can because of the dollar. And yet people feel, this sense of anxiety, and because there's so much change, and then demagogues take advantage of that anxiety and I'll tell you why. It's all these people's fault. And then you point at someone.
You point in the book that India's a country that you really think as we go forward is going to be really reach that superpower status in the conversation of the U.S. and China, which I think is so spot on. It's something I don't think people talk about as much as they should. Um, um, we're going to finish up in a few minutes. I want to shift topics. You've written 5 books, so we can't cover all 5 today, as I mentioned. But in you wrote a book called "In Defense of Liberal Education," which was in 2015. I can't imagine you were prepared for the attack on on the education system and on a liberal education system the way it's happened today. If you were, you know pitching to your editors an update of the book, and maybe you're making one. What is your defense of liberal education today, and is it the same as it was in 2015?
Well, today it's almost like you're trying to defend the institutions themselves. In those days, what I was trying to do was argue against too much pre-professionalism and too much of everybody becoming a computer science major, which, by the way, has turned out to be a very prescient prediction. When I said to people, don't worry, don't all jump into computer science and coding, because the one thing AI does better than anything else is coding. And so Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, has called this the revenge of the English major, because the best language to code in for the future, he says, is going to be English, because you just tell the AI what you want it to do. But the attack now is really a much more, it's like our version of the Cultural Revolution, Jamie. What we're going through is a whole-scale assault on the idea of these institutions as as institutions of higher learning, the status that they enjoy, and it's at some level so massively self-defeating, because there are very few areas in the world in which the US has the kind of supremacy that it does in higher education. If you look at the rankings, US, universities are, 70% of the top 100 universities in the world come from the United States. Just think about that. We're 4% of the population and 70% of the best universities in the world. So we have an amazing model, which is that the universities are both public and private. They kind of compete against each other. The federal government funds but does not administer. This is all very different from other places in the world where most universities are essentially state-run bureaucracies. So we have a kind of amazing ecosystem, and it's being attacked and destroyed for reasons that are mostly, as I say, this kind of deep cultural resentment. There are some real problems, believe me. There's a problem that they were too lax on anti-Semitism, but there's also a problem of grade inflation and a lot of bullshit subjects that have gotten into the curriculum, and there is, and some woke ideology. But to put it in perspective, the vast majority of what these universities do, the highest end universities, is really groundbreaking research in the sciences and social sciences. And that stuff is all at peril, because that's what all the funding goes. You're cutting off cancer research at Harvard to, to protest against what some, 5 students in the women's studies department did when they were parading at Harvard Yard. It's nuts. So what I worry about is that you're going to undermine these institutions, and you're trying at the same time to shut off the spigot of the most talented people in the world who used to come here. So we were talking to a friend of mine who runs a education business in India that provides loans to Indians who need to go abroad. The number of people applying for loans to go abroad to the United States has dropped by 50% in one year. So you're not, if you're not getting the most talented Indians and the most talented Chinese, that's what was fueling Silicon Valley. I don't know if you saw this, the recent data, 50% of the Silicon Valley AI startups have immigrant founders. So what I worry about is that whole ecosystem that was one of our crown jewels is now being undermined because there's a kind of cultural anti-elitism that says, we have to tear all this down, and it's being encouraged by a lot of these tech bros in Northern California who think that that's how you build and destroy great companies. But what might work for a company, for some startup in, putting out an app, is not the same as the institutions of higher learning. Oxford was founded in the 12th century, and it's still one of the top five universities in the world, as is Cambridge, right? Like that. The truth is, with universities, there's an enormous amount of strength that comes from the weight of the institution and the weight of that history.
Yeah, I'm a strong believer in liberal education. It hasn't changed for me. I'm proud to have one child at UNC Chapel Hill, and I think it's
Great place, yeah.
the greatest thing that could have happened. I went to school in Atlanta to Emory, and I think those opportunities, if you're fortunate and lucky enough to be able to do that, which not everybody can for a lot of reasons, I think we're really lucky. Let me get to a couple of questions. First, Tendo Nagenda had a question, which was, how would you suggest liberals who are not anti-Zionist more effectively express their horror at the war in Gaza?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, because I so many of my friends would put themselves, I think, in that position. American Jews who are very uncomfortable with what's happening, but don't want to seem as though they're, siding with Israel's enemies, or don't want to say anything in an atmosphere of rising anti-Semitism, which is true and frankly horrifying. Um, I think if it could be couched in terms of, is this good for Israel? I think that that's so for me, as I say, as somebody who supports Israel very strongly, I look at it and I listen to the people like Ehud Olmert and Ehud Barak, and read a lot of the people writing for Haaretz, and I can see these are Israelis who obviously care deeply about their country and deeply about the future of their country, and they're saying, "Look, this is not sustainable. Right? What you're doing is." Ben Gurion, when he founded Israel, said Israel will be a light unto nations. That was the promise, that yes, this is a country that does privilege in some ways the idea of being a Jewish nation, but we also want to be a nation that is deeply rooted in liberal democracy and Enlightenment values and respect for everybody. And you can't let down that part of the tradition. So I feel like it has to be done in those terms. And there are plenty of Israelis doing it. I'm always struck by how the debate in Israel is much richer and much wider than the debate among American Jews about Israel.
It's one of the toughest things I have to deal with, and I know a lot of my friends do. Richard Cohn had a question, which is, when it comes to foreign policy, do you think the old Western alliance can recover from the Trump years?
I think so, because we've built something amazing over the last 80 years. It is the first alliance in human history that is so deeply rooted in values and interests and in an enlightened sense of what is better for the world. And this is a kind of society to society alliance. I think we feel it as people and they feel it as people. And I think it transcends one administration. And I think Trump, even though he tries, at the end of the day, when he needs to get stuff done, he realizes, you rely on the Europeans. If you want to do something about China, how are you going to do it if you don't have the Europeans on your side? We're not large enough. So I would hope that even Trump will come around to realizing that this is the greatest force multiplier the United States has ever had. We have 59 treaty allies in the world. I think that's the latest number I saw. And you ask yourself, how many does China have? Basically two, Russia and North Korea. Um, and that's such a powerful advantage. And the idea of squandering that seems to me just unthinkable.
I agree. Um, I'm going to go to another question from Gay Otavani. And the question is, how is the war in the Middle East affecting the war in the Ukraine?
So the war in the Middle East and the war in Ukraine are not, the only sense in which I think that there's a connection is that you see how the bad guys are helping each other. So if you look at those two places, who was supporting Assad in Syria? Absolutely barbarous dictator. It was the Iranians and the Russians. You look at Russia right now. Who is supporting the Russians? It's the Iranians with their drones, which were the origin of the entire Russian drone program. I had a very interesting moment where I had the Iranian foreign minister on the show, not the current one, the one before. And I said to him, why are you guys helping the Russians kill Ukrainian civilians, bomb Ukrainian cities? And he said, we're not doing any of that. I said, you're sending them drones. He said, we're not sending them drones. I said, Mr. Foreign Minister, the drones that the Russians use in Ukraine are called Shahid drones. Shahid is the Persian word for martyr. Why do you think the Russians would be using a Persian word for martyr to describe to as the name of their drones if they were not Iranian drones? And he was like, I don't know why, but they're calling them that. So, this is something I think we don't focus enough on, which is that these guys, the North Koreans, the Russians, the Iranians, the Chinese, they're all acting together. And we, meanwhile, are having this crazy internecine warfare over tariffs. We should be consolidating so that we can present a united front to them, just as they are presenting a united front to us.
Well said. Judd Apatow had a question, which was, why do you think there's no leader to the opposition? And is there something that can stop the momentum?
It's hard for the American system. You don't have, like in Britain, you have the opposition in Parliament. There's a leader of the party. That person is called the leader of the opposition. Um, in the American system, when the party is not in the White House, it is in the wilderness politically, and it doesn't have a leader. It has a lot of entrepreneurs who want to be leader, and that contest is what defines the period when you're out of power. So it's a hard challenge, and that's why people often say, well, why doesn't Obama take up the culture, why doesn't somebody else like that? Well, Obama is not going to really be the appropriate leader of the opposition because he's out of power, he's out of political office, he's retired. So you've got to find somebody within that group of entrepreneurs, but that's what's going on now. Gavin Newsom would like to be that person, and Josh Shapiro would like to be that person. I actually think the Democrats have a pretty good slate of governors. If you think of Andy Bashir, Wes Moore, Shapiro, I think they're all interesting. They're all smart, and I think you need somebody who is like a common sense Democrat, who comes across as somebody who gets stuff done, who, no bullshit, I'm not pandering to the progressive wing, and just contorting myself and using weird words like Latinx, just straight shooting, straight talking. So I think, one shouldn't despair. The truth is, this is what happens when you're out of office and when you don't have the White House. But then somebody comes around. Look, the Democrats always do best when it's somebody who's a kind of fresh face out of nowhere, charismatic, and then, kind of people say Democrats like to fall in love, Republicans like to fall in line. And if you think of Kennedy, Clinton, Obama, that's the Democratic pattern.
I love that. So well said. Okay, we're going to finish up. To that extent, I'm starting a new series, which I'm calling Meet the Candidates, which is going to be all about different exciting voices, some that we've heard of, like people you just mentioned. And I think that bench is really deep. I talk about it all the time. And then some people, like new people. Our first person's going to be Mallory McMorrow, who I think is fantastic, running in Michigan. She'll be next Tuesday at 12 o'clock. So I think that there are really exciting names, people saying great things. I think we have to let people make mistakes and let people say the wrong thing and not jump all over them. And that's one of our big challenges. Fareed, before you go, I'm going to put you on the spot, but I'd love you to give us your take. I'm going to ask you to use your tagline and send us out and tell us what your take is on today, on the world, on this conversation. You can improvise, but I have to take advantage of this opportunity.
Well, my take, on this conversation, I think that one of the things that gives me hope, you guys, I'm sure are all thinking about what gives one hope. I think that the thing about America there's a lot more bottom-up activity than you realize. We are all looking at Washington, and it maybe gets a lot of us depressed, right? You're tearing down the NIH, you're tearing down all these institutions, you're cutting foreign aid to the poorest people in the world. But what we're not seeing is there are a lot of people in the country who are just like you, worried and agitated. And it's, they're talking and they're organizing and they're trying to figure out how can they work together. So just think about what you were just talking about. You're bringing and highlighting some of the new voices in the Democratic Party. So I think that the thing that always gives me hope about America is the thing that Tocqueville noticed when he came to America in 1832, which was this, he called it intermediate organization, meaning groups that are not the family, but not the government, that they lie between the family and the government, what we would probably call civil society. And this podcast and the way you've brought people together is one of those Tocquevillian features of American life that, is a part of the way that citizens get organized because they care about the community, they care about the country. And I think that's what gives me hope. That's what makes me think, you know what? We'll be around another 250 years.
I love that. And it reminds me of the Bill Clinton quote: there's nothing wrong with America that cannot be cured by what's right with America.
Yeah, yeah.
Bree, thank you so much. It really has been an honor, and I can't wait to talk to you again and maybe see you in person someday. Thank you. And thanks, everybody.
This is so fun. Thank you, and give my best to your dad.
I will. Thanks. Bye.